two of the finest minds, foreign policy dilemmas in our country. Sheikh Saab, Najmuddin Shaikh Saab, is no stranger to this institute. He has often shared his wisdom and his insight with us. As we all know, he is a distinguished diplomat of Pakistan, the Foreign Secretary of Pakistan from 1994. And as I often like to say, he was my boss for a few years, a couple of years. He was our ambassador to many countries, to Canada, to West Germany, to the United States of America, and to Iran. And he has also served as Pakistan's special envoy to the Yemen, to Sudan, Kenya, and Bahrain. The other speaker with us today, Lieutenant General Tariq Waseem Ghazi. He has had a star-studded career in the army, and after retirement, he has had a very distinguished military career in many capacities. 2000 for a few years, and he retired from the army. He was commandant of two very important military institutions, the Command Staff Quetta, the College Quetta, and the National Defence University in Islamabad. But he has also held many positions of importance outside the army. He was chairman of the Civil Aviation Authority, chairman of 40 Foundation. He also headed PIIA investments. But most importantly for our purpose today, he has been a very active member, like Sheikh Saab, appeared together at many forums, and he dialogue between India and Pakistan, which take place on him. And importance for this institute, that two of the wisest minds are present here today to discuss a subject which has agitated all of us and which is discussed on every forum, in the print media, in the electronic media, on all news channels, and that is the current state of affairs of relations between America and Pakistan. But first I will request Sheikh Saab to take the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nazima, for that introduction and for bringing me back to an institute with which I've had a very good connection. Sorry, this is rather louder than I thought. Okay. I thought I would start by talking a little bit about the myths that prevail. We talked about the betrayal, that we are old friends with common interests, with mutual interests. This has never been the case. We talk about our relationship being transactional as though this is a new phenomenon. It is not. Our relationship has been transactional right from the start. It has been based on what I call a contrived commonality. We do not have a common aversion to the Soviet Union. We were a little bit concerned about whether the Soviet rule in Afghanistan would expand or not, but we had no genuine quarrel with the Soviet Union. But we chose to become anti-communist and to talk about the godless communists as opposed to Pakistan's true ideology, so that we could establish this commonality, secure the assistance that we needed, which was for security against India. It had nothing to do with containing the Soviet Union or otherwise. Similarly, even more recently, when we were part of the Afghan Jihad, and we were in fact the tail that wagged the dog insofar as that particular jihad was concerned, we were genuinely concerned about the fact that if the Soviet Union consolidated its position in Afghanistan, then it would be only a matter of time before they expanded into Balochistan and up to the Arabian Sea. The old belief that the Soviet Union was looking for the warm waters of the Arabian Sea, since many of its ports were otherwise blocked. The Americans had a different idea. The Americans said what the Soviets did to us in Vietnam, we will do unto them in Afghanistan. Entirely different purposes. If we had a commonality of purpose, perhaps a commonality of purpose that could have come into being and should have come into being was the war against terror. But again, and there I think we've found, I remember saying in 2009 that the one thing that one time that we are going to be able to talk about commonality, this was 2009, I said we're going to be able to talk about commonalities because we are stricken by we are the victims of terrorism, and for the United States and United States foreign policy, terrorism is going to be the dominant theme at least for the next decade. The only correction I would like to make is that I said that in 2009 for a decade, but now I would say for a quarter century more. Because I think that with Daesh rising and Daesh becoming a potent force, not by way of only having territory, but by having an ideology and a belief that is venomous in our view, but is appealing to many. So we must recognize this. Now this I thought was necessary to establish. The only time that there was talk about changing the nature of the relationship was ironically in August of 2001. Deputy Secretary Armitage came to India to get support for the ballistic missile defense proposal. He got that, but he gave an interview to the Hindu, and he said, it is unfortunate that our relation with Pakistan in the past has always been based on being against something, against India, against the Soviet Union, but never for the relationship between the United States, people of the United States and the people of Pakistan. And he said that it will be my endeavor to try and establish a relationship between the people of the United States and the people of Pakistan. And added, unfortunately, to prevent the Talibanization of Pakistan. And I thought to myself when I read this, that have we come to this point where Talibanization is what the world, in terms of the United States, sees as the prospect for Pakistan. Of course, that did not last for very long because September 11 changed the picture entirely. As the background, and perhaps in the course of this I will also talk about all of the egregious errors or things that the United States did. I'd only like to mention one to start with. Why did Osama bin Laden shift from the Sudan to Afghanistan? Why did the United States allow this to happen? The Sudanese said, we will transfer him to Saudi Arabia. The Saudis said, we don't want him. And we understand why the Saudis didn't want him, because bin Laden was, the Laden family was a very important family in Saudi Arabia. They said to the United States, take him. The United States said, no, we don't want him. And we have never been clear as to why they said they don't want him. But he then traveled in a C-130 from the Sudan to Afghanistan, where in the Sudan he was a relatively unknown figure who was safely held in custody, so to speak, house arrest by the Sudanese authorities, and moved to Afghanistan, where he was a hero. He was a hero of the Afghan Jihad, and so regarded by Afghans across the world. And so what happens? He's allowed to go to Afghanistan, and 2 years later, there is an American general, I think he is General Ralston, who is sitting in the office of our Chief of Army Staff, saying, we are firing missiles across your airspace, but don't worry, they're not meant for you. We are trying to get a camp in Afghanistan where we believe that Osama bin Laden is. It was a camp run in part by the what is now known as the Al-Khani network, and the missiles hit, but bin Laden was not there. So you see this, 96, 98, what a change is there, my friends. And if you say if I say that people think in terms of some sort of conspiracy or some sort of lack of sagacity, lack of perspicacity on the part of the American planners, would we be wrong? Is this how the world's only superpower, or currently at that time the only superpower, was, is that the quality of the planning that they have? That if there is a sworn enemy, you move him to where his support is, and then 2 years later you say, sorry, he's done something, so you've got to try and punish him there. So I give this to you as the background to what is our current situation. The current situation is that President Trump, New Year tweet, all of us I think know exactly what that tweet was. Perhaps all of us are not aware of how that tweet came about. All the speculation is that he was being his usual self, he yielded to impulse, etc. I think that there is a slightly more rational explanation, which is that in the New York Times of the 29th of December, there appeared an article which said that the American-Canadian family, which had been rescued in October, and for which President Trump had high words of praise for Pakistan, that Pakistan, our relationship has improved, Pakistan has done very good things, etc., etc. That was October. But by December, the Americans were complaining that the Pakistanis had captured one Haqqani network operative when this rescue operation took place, and that we asked for permission to interrogate him since we believed that he would be able to give us a lead to two other Americans who were still being held by the Haqqani network. And we did not give that access. This is the 29th of December. I'm sure that on the 30th or the 31st, the presidential daily briefing contained a reference to this. And this, to my mind, is what triggered the tweet that I think every sensible member of the American foreign policy establishment regrets happened. But it did happen, and he threatened a cutoff, and the State Department and all other departments in the United States spent the next 3 days trying to put together exactly what the suspension of assistance to Pakistan would mean. So you heard figures which range from 2 billion to 1 billion to somewhere in between. But my own assessment is that it is about 2 billion. It is about 2 billion because there's a billion in the background, and there's another provision in the new budget which would take us to about 2 billion. Now, what have the Americans said with regard to this? Today there was an announcement by our Foreign Secretary in briefing the Senate that they have said that IMET will continue notwithstanding the international military education training on which they spend about 2.5 or 3 million a year, that this will continue. And by the same token, I'm sure that while Alice Wales was here, there's Deputy Assistant Secretary, she said that or indicated that there will be other programs, for instance, anti-narcotics, which will probably continue. I'm suggesting that that is the third thing is that we've said that we do not need this $2 billion or whatever aid because we can survive without that. We want a relationship based on trust and confidence. We've also said that we feel betrayed, and we do not regard Pakistan as the United States as a friend anymore. And but he very carefully refrained from saying anything about the fact that the United States access to the overland route or to our airspace would be shut off at this particular point. We have had detailed discussions both in the civilian sector and within the army, and it seems that now the principal focus is the discussion between General Motul CENTCOM commander and our people at headquarters. What we hear from the ISPR is that the discussions are continuing. Our engagement is not broken. We will continue this discussion, and on the key question, I heard a thing which I thought was very important, that with regard to the Haqqani network, there are things happening which will be made public shortly. You said this about 10 days ago or 8 days ago, but that particular action or whatever was being planned has not yet been reported. So we have to wait and see what that particular report is going to be about. Now, when we look at the crux of how this problem arises, it arises with regard to Afghanistan. It arises with regard to the American conviction that Pakistan's war against terrorism, while laudable, has been selective, and that people who are attacking Americans in Afghanistan are not being targeted in that particular operation. Therefore, until that is done, we cannot, our relationship with with Pakistan cannot be returned to the relationship that existed in the past. How much truth there is in this, we categorically maintain that there is no organized presence of the Haqqani network. The Americans had initially, let me add this point, that the Americans had initially said that their secretary would have to certify that action was being taken against the Haqqani network and against the Lashkar-e-Taiba or the Falah Insaniat Foundation, etc., or the other affiliated bodies. But in their National Defense Authorization Act, the requirement of action against the Lashkar-e-Taiba was removed, and they made it clear that their focus was on the Haqqani network, and therefore on what could be done for against them in Afghanistan by people that they said were operating from Pakistan soil. We have said that there is no organized presence of the Haqqanis in Pakistan, and that if there are intelligence, if there is intelligence sharing, that you identify where they are, we will take action against them. Of course, in the past, the record has been somewhat dubious on this account. The Americans maintained that when they shared the information, people were allowed to escape rather than being caught. Now, this is part of an old history, which, as incidentally, I went back and looked at what was happening in 2003, for instance. And from 2003, I chose 2003 because in 2003, President Bush invited President Musharraf to Camp David and told him that we will give you $3 billion over a 5-year time, 5-year period, in installments of 600 million a year, and you have to decide as to how much you want by way of defense equipment, how much you want by way of economic assistance. But I must tell you that we will not give you the F-16s. And I think he also explained to him that Mr. Advani was here and he complained about the possibility that you will get F-16s and requested that F-16 not be given to Pakistan, and President Bush had apparently given him a promise that he would not do so. I mention this again because this thought that the relationship with India is of recent origin is not so. The cultivation of India had commenced long time earlier, and is a continuation of what has been happening, including the 2005 civil nuclear agreement. So we take this as the background, and then we look at the situation in within Afghanistan. My feeling is that right now Afghanistan is not going to have peace and stability or even a modicum of peace and stability till at least the year 2030, 2035. And I'll tell you why. There is a tremendous political divide within the country. The NUG government, the National Unity Government, consisting of President Ghani and his chief executive Abdullah, told Najmuddin, the governor of Balkh, that his resignation was being accepted. Now, the resignation letter was a little dubious, and Najmuddin had a right to protest, but he said, no, I'm not resigning. At the other end of the country, General Tariq in Qatar was told that he should refrain from politics, whereupon he said that I have not been appointed by you. I have been appointed by the people, and I will not leave until the people tell me to leave. This is the country. These are two extreme examples, but all over, warlords are denying the government any authority. The government is supposed to have elections on in July 2018. The Independent Election Commission and the Election Complaints Commission are two bodies which are responsible for holding the elections. The Independent Election Commissioner chairman resigned, was fired in fact by Ghani. Now the people that he appointed to select a new man have made their recommendations, but that recommendation has not yet been implemented. July is not very far away. There have been identity cards issued far in excess of the number of voters that should be there. And there are a whole host of other problems which seem to make it impossible for this election to be held. This election was to be for the district councils and the parliamentary election, to be followed in 2019 by the presidential election. I don't see any of this happening because unfortunately time is short, the political situation is fraught, and therefore politically disturbed Afghanistan will remain. But even more important, Afghanistan's total exports today are $500 million. You hear lots of figures, but the truth is that $500 million is the total export. Their imports are about $8 billion. Today, their budget, 63% in 2017, in the last financial year, 63% of their budget came from foreign assistance. This year, they are hoping that it will be reduced to 55%. I see limited prospect of that happening. But more importantly, their army and their what is called the Afghan National Defense Security Force has funded almost entirely by the allies, 90% or more from the United States of America, which spends $4.1 billion a year on this. The Afghans cannot do it. Yesterday, there was an interview that he gave to CBC, which was broadcast, and which said that he said that our government would collapse within 6 months if financing was withdrawn. He's exaggerating. It will collapse in 2 months. There is no possibility of, if you calculate $4.1 billion a year for 2 months. For 2 months, that is in itself an amount which would cut out the budget, which is less than $5 billion a year. So I think we know that Afghanistan's economy cannot survive without this. 3, is there a genuine desire for stability? 9,000 tons of opium have been produced in Afghanistan last year. Everybody shares in that. We talk about the fact that the Taliban get a major part of their funding from this, but the government officials, warlords, those who control the trafficking routes, all make money out of this. And so that, if you call Afghanistan, which is now at more than 80% of the total world production, narco economy, you will be right, because every facet of Afghan society appears to benefit from this. Afghanistan today has 40% unemployment. There are very good prospects for Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a transit country. If the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline comes through, if CASA, the Central Asia, South Asia transmission lines come through, there will be millions in either gas and electricity availability or in cash for the transit country. But until security comes, this cannot continue. There can be a lot more earned by Afghanistan if there is trade between South Asia and Central Asia via Afghanistan. Transit fees are things that I will talk about later in terms of what our own solution should be. I'm also exceeding the time. But if we do this, it lies in the remote future. It's not going to happen. You heard talk about $1 trillion worth of mineral deposits. The Afghans themselves claim that it is $3 trillion. None of this is going to come. $20 million worth of mining is done, of which a minuscule portion comes to the government. The rest is embezzled or is mined by the Taliban. It will take a very long time before this comes to fruition. If there is a good example of this, it is the Ainak copper mine, which was a project given to the Chinese, and the Hajigak coal mine, iron ore mines. And the initial reaction was that China would build a power plant, it would build a smelter, and Ainak was one of the richest copper deposits in the world, and a great deal of money by way of royalties would flow to Afghanistan. Today, the Chinese have asked for a renegotiation of the contract. They don't want to build the railroad. They say there isn't enough copper to justify a smelter. Therefore, there is no reason to build a power plant, and so on. So the entire thing has to be renegotiated. The Indian consortium of steel companies which were going to mine ore in Hajigak have all stepped back, and first they trimmed the blood program, then they dropped it altogether. So, by my reckoning, Afghanistan, for its survival, is not going to be able to depend on its own resources. It must continue over, not till 2020, which is the commitment in Tokyo, where they were promised 16 billion over 4 years, 2016 to 2020. But they must have this assistance until 2030, by my reckoning, if we are lucky. And if they don't get it, then you're going to have an economic collapse in Pakistan. And if you have an economic collapse in Pakistan, which is the one country into which they can cross, there are two, in fact, but Iran and Pakistan. But Iran, there's been a lot of uproar about the fact that Pakistan wants to send Afghan refugees back. But Iran has been doing this consistently and is consistently guarding against freshening floods, except for those that they recruit in order to utilize in the war in Syria and Iraq. So, till 2030, maybe my own estimate is that if reconciliation comes, reconciliation is going to be very difficult. First, the Taliban are not united. Today, Abatullah Ahund, wherever he is, does not command the same loyalty as Mullah Umar did, or even what Mullah Akhtar Mansoor did. The people in Helmand who earn much of the money from the opium cultivation and opium narcotic are not sending the money to Abatullah. Monies that are being collected in the Gulf are not necessarily going into the coffers of the Taliban treasury as such, but are being dispersed over a larger area. You heard stories, and I have heard stories about Akhtar Mansoor having accumulated rather large assets all over the world. Those are stories that are not entirely unfounded. So my point is that from our perspective and from the perspective of stability in the region, you will find that perhaps you will have no choice but to seek to ensure that foreign assistance and therefore by extension foreign presence in Afghanistan is tolerated at least until 2030, 2035. And this is a reality that you have to face because the consequences otherwise are most difficult for you. What can we do to promote that reconciliation is a question that is often asked. Sure, okay. I can stop here. I should have stopped much longer.
Thank you, Sheikh Sir. I will now request General Ghazi to please take the floor. जरा एक मिनट पीछे जो साहब भी शोर मचा रहे हैं उनसे कहें चुप हो जाए, पीछे से जो आवाज आ रही है। गाजी सर।
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, Dr. Waseem, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here for the first time, as he said during the introduction, which was a very kind one. I know he referred to two brains being here, and I can say the left part of the brain is working very well. Be a little skeptical of the right side of the brain. So being here for the first time, it's a good thing in the sense that both of us don't have any expectation. So I can proceed from what Najm Sahab has outlined. It's always good to follow him because he lays out in precise details and with timelines some of those essential things that then if you're following him, you can indulge in a lot of frivolity and touch on subjects that are a little more abstract or a little philosophical, and that's what I intend to do. We are here obviously because there is a certain urgency with regard to the latest spat that has occurred between the US and Pakistan, following from the tweet that President Trump let out in the beginning of the year to welcome 2018. But I was thinking that there's a great deal of difference 1 year makes, because I will ask you to recall 2017, the start of the year, and the first ever phone call that President Trump made ostensibly to the Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, where he waxed lyrical. Pakistan, he said, was a fantastic country full of fantastic people. 2 months later, there was a bill being proposed in the US Congress that wanted to sponsor Pakistan as a state sponsor of terrorism. 2 months later, he was in Riyadh, Trump, and he did not even mention Pakistan there. Another 2 months later, they had the National Security Strategy paper brought out, which produced India as its strategic partner in this region with, again, no clear mention of Pakistan's cooperation or role in that structure in the region. Another 2 months and Pakistan was put on notice, and another 2 months Trump comes up with this thing about lies and deceit. So for everything it's been a very, I think, symptomatic, emblematic of the tumultuous nature of our ties, the Pakistan-US ties. They've been cyclic. They have had their peaks and valleys, and they have troughs and shallows. It's been transitional and transactional both. And for me, the only real surprise is that it comes as all I see this is that Trump is actually a new face. He's not a new factor in the US outlook on Pakistan. I think what he represents is that the relations are now being fought with the gloves that are off. The pretense that we had in the diplomacy is gone, and the true nature of our relationship, which has always been transactional, has been revealed. Now, I think to be able to understand these relationships, we must look at how the US worldview exists. And I see that the US worldview is actually based on two dimensions. Its internal dimension, where it tends to govern its own society and its own people and its own citizens by a process of law, of accountability, of very strict principles, of a system that is meant to ensure a very equitable and a just relationship between the citizens and its government. And then there is that external dimension of the US, where it is a self-serving, where it becomes a law unto itself, where it is driven solely by self-interest, where it pursues what is a very predatory policy of might, of grabbing what is not its by right. And therefore, what we see the US is a two-faced, duplicitous, deceitful entity that needs to be analyzed in that perspective. I also think that, I've been a regular visitor to the US, my children are there, and so I have to go there at least once, not twice a year. I've been doing that ever since I retired in 2007 from the Secretary of Defense position. So the last 10 years, every year I've been going. And what I'm going to talk to you about now, or outline now, which has been outlined actually in an article that was published very recently on the 11th of January in the New York Times by a gentleman called Charles M. Blow. And the title of that article is The Lowest Man. So I have evidenced this creep toward the lowest man actually taking place in 10 years, and more so in the last about 3 to 4 years. Very rapidly. So the American society internally has come to represent what Trump represents. And this author, Charles Blow, in this article says that Trump is a man who, quote, says anything to please the people in front of him, anything to keep them angry, even telling lies. He will have demonstrated once again his incompetence and unfitness. And once again, they, that is his base, won't care. So he will lie, he will, as long as he is making them angrier. Now why is this? It is because I think the white in the United States are feeling besieged, and they are now fighting back in the same way as they've always learned to amass the entire United States for itself. And they think that it needs to go back to its founding fathers' days, or the earlier days of that, of regaining from the natives a United States or an America that was built for the white. The same author again goes on to say, and I quote, Trumpism is a religion which is founded on patriarchy and white supremacy. It is a belief that the lowest white man is better than the best colored man. And Trump represents white people's right to be wrong and still be right. He is the embodiment of the unassailability of white power and white privilege. To abandon him is to give up on the pact that America has made with its white citizens from the beginning, which is that the government will help underwrite white safety and success, even at the expense of other people in this country. No matter how much of an embarrassment and a failure Trump proves to be, his exploits must be judged a success. He must be deemed a correction to Barack Obama. White supremacy demands it, patriarchy demands it, and Trump's supporters demand it. So this is now that domestic environment that has been created, that has enabled him to rise to become the President of the United States. And this rise, as I said, When I was in the US in 2016, and he was a contender, I thought it was a joke. He was just doing it for personal publicity, for his business empire. When I was there toward the closing stages of 2016, I could sense that he would be elected. It was a transition of only about 9 to 10 months between these two visits. And I could see this transformation in the manner in which people moved around in the cities, on the streets. They interacted with you in the malls and in the bazaars and wherever else you met them, in the manner in which the whites would certainly congregate separately in even cafes and restaurants to the coloreds. And how those communities had shifted also out of these areas into little suburbs which they were creating as white suburbs. And this was all taking place in a very, very short span of time. So I was not surprised when he got elected. Now, this kind of an agenda, there is a pushback in the United States against this agenda. There are liberal states that are working against it. And the Pakistan-US relations, I think, will to a great deal depend on the success or otherwise of this pushback. If they succeed, then I think there is some hope for us going forward. If they do not, then I think turbulent times lie ahead. Now, the other dimension that I spoke about was the one that is external. And the external dimension, I think, in the US-Pak relations or the US relations with the world are colored by the China and US competition, rivalry, and relations that will eventually shape the future in the next 25, 30, 40 years. The significance for us is that we are an important element in this relationship. At the same time, India is a US partner, and its relation with Pakistan also will determine the manner in which this policy towards China moves forward. And I see Afghanistan as the preferred battleground to test and challenge both China and Pakistan. The CPEC is something that I see as a potential to change China from a one ocean to a two ocean superpower that can then be able to frustrate not only the Asia-Pacific strategy and geopolitics of the United States, but what they have now extended to become the Indo-Pacific strategic partnership and areas of dominance. There is also the factor of resurgent Russia and the development of their increasing cooperation with China on both military and economic links, which has the potential of upsetting this US-Asian alliances here. And as an additional factor, there is in the US mind still an ambivalence with regard to India's ability to be faithful to US interests and be able to execute the deliverables with Afghanistan. And there is a very strange phenomenon. When we interact, or I've interacted with the Americans, both in their State Department and in their Pentagon, and also in some of their strategic establishments at a very high level, a lot of them come to me and take me aside and say, I'd like to understand how you've been dealing with India. We find them very complex. We find them very hard to understand. We'd like to get a feel of how you've been dealing with them for 70 years, so what is the manner in which you will negotiate with them? So, to one very high-ranking official in the State Department, I said, well, yes, you're right in a way, because the Indians would like to play with shifting goalposts. So he said, no, General, It's not shifting goalposts. They'd like to play with no goalposts on their side. Now, how do I deal with that? So there is this is just not just an incident or a recalling of one particular encounter, but it is a feeling that I feel exists in the US establishment and how they need to deal with them. They're not so faithful. You talk to the Indians, and we do on a track too, and we find them equally suspicious of US motives. Now, where this process goes and how well it goes will again will have its own implications for us. And I think something very succinct on this issue was said by Mr. Munir Akram, who's our ex-ambassador. And he said, while America's historical alliances no doubt enhance its global power and influence, it is also constrained politically and militarily by legacy issues such as the unconditional commitment to Israel, the war on terror, the intervention in Iraq and Syria, the confrontation with Iran, the Afghan quagmire, and the new Cold War with Russia. So there are constraints and there are constricting spaces that exist even externally for the US to be able to execute everything that it does. Now, within this, I do find that what Trump has been able to do is that he's been able to understand that with the pushback domestically, he does not have enough maneuverability or flexibility to impose his will or his ideas on the US public without there being a very thorough due process and accountability and a very thorough debate. So he finds himself lacking maneuverability there. His way of reacting to that frustration is to lash out globally. And that is why you see him scrapping the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the climate change partnership, the shifting of the embassy to Jerusalem, the manner in which he's been threatening North Korea, removing the sanctions from Iran. So all of these are those for which he no longer needs to be accountable. He thinks he doesn't need to be accountable to anyone else. He can serve those, he has more freedom, he has more maneuver to be able to do that. And it actually creates a base, a greater support within that angry base that he has created of the white supremacists. And they think he's doing a fantastic job. You just have to talk to some one of them. And they think he's the only one who can take the world to task for all the ill that the world has done to the United States. Okay. Now, what about Afghanistan? I think the US has decided to stay in Afghanistan. It's not getting out. That's what Obama wanted. So we should consider this as a given. We must also understand that the Americans probably know it, they don't want to admit it, but they can no longer defeat the Taliban. Therefore, if they can't defeat the Taliban, they should look for a political solution. But the Americans are not interested in an equitable political solution or a settlement either. What it wants to use, in my opinion, is Afghanistan as a base readily available to contain a future China, to resist Russia, to push back on Iran, and to course Pakistan. And I think it needs, seeks to make India a partner in its efforts to do so. US will make demands and he will cloak it in the garb of concern for our stability and the safety of our nuclear weapons. Now, I would also urge you to look at another thing with regard to this debate that's been spurred recently on how much leverage does the US have. It's called the leverage paradox, Pakistan and the United States, by Robert Hathaway. It's recently come out. which traces the history of the ties between Islamabad and Washington from 1950 to the present Trump era. It's interesting what it concludes, because it's this American author himself who concludes that Pakistan cannot be bludgeoned into taking steps it believes dangerous to its security, even if it means losing US aid. The repeated US effort to condition aid to behavior has failed to induce the better behavior that Washington had hoped for. And he further demonstrates how efforts to coerce Pakistan merely reinforced Islamabad's belief for Pakistan that its putative friend, which is the US, sought only to advance a US agenda at odds with Pakistan's security. Washington's inability to recognize this reality repeatedly led US decision makers to overestimate the leverage their power gave them. What he goes on to then say is that Pakistan has held three usually valuable assets. It has occupied strategic geography, possesses considerable strength in its own right, and was able to capitalize on the needs of the stronger to further its own ends. So he gives us credit for having played our cards in the manner in which, well, you can call it lies and deceit, but that is what geopolitics is all about. Now, a word here about the storm in a tweet cup, as I call it, is to try and examine whether this is state policy, or is it something that, as they say, Mr. Trump woke up on the wrong side of the bed and decided to, or maybe had the wrong kind of cheeseburger. I do not think it is state policy, because subsequent actions at fence mending, both at the military level, at the state diplomatic level, in trying to explain, in trying to, sort of downplay those aspects, do some fence mending activities, all indicate that the US doesn't want that break. It wants to tread its ground softly, strangely, still with a big stick in its hand. The other question, of course, is this anger only relative to the Afghan situation? Our support there or non-support there, our help to get them out of it or make them comfortable, or does it extend to the broader US-Pakistan relations? And I think that is again something that is open to discussions. For us, the matters I think that are of concern are that there is no talk on the US side of a negotiated settlement to the end of war in Afghanistan. And that is something that worries us, because that means that there will be more and more of this continuing instability. And of course, the second thing is the development of this US-India strategic partnership to increase India's role in Afghanistan, which is like a red rag before the bull. It strikes at the at vital Pakistani interest to keep Indian influence at bay to prevent its encirclement. Now, the thing about this 33 billion, there's a very nice expose yesterday in Dawn, and I think it's accurate. I can at least vouch for the 2 years that I was there as the Defense Secretary, and the amount of money that came in. There's always been claims. We used to make claims, and then there was a disbursement that came. And the claims amount to about 23 billion. The actual disbursement is around 14 billion, so it's not 33 billion at all. Now, where this figure comes, it depends on having a good accountant who will put everybody else, or a good income tax official who will extract everything from you. But these have been the kind of payments, and these are not payments that we can't live without. Now, in this final section, just take maybe just 10 minutes, 5 minutes. It's about geopolitics generally, to see this perspective, I belong to the realist school, and therefore I think we need to understand that the environments are shaped by these strategic rivalries. There is no need for us to get very woolly or teary-eyed about principles and attitudes and so on and so forth. Everybody works for their own self-interest. It dominates their thinking, it predetermines. But we must understand that there are layers to the relationship that we have, and it is what is that layer that we would like bilaterally or multilaterally to be played in, which is the one that will matter most in this crisis, and who we need to deal with on the basis of it being decisive. And I think we have a sufficient experience of having dealt with one another to be able to understand where in this entire layering of our relationship we need to peg in to be able to somehow do some damage control. Now, as I said, US is a predatory power. It has never got anything in its life without using might. So it believes that it will always get, as long as it has power, it has military, it has the ability to force and coerce and arm twist anyone, it will get what it wants. That is why, what we do not know, in 149 countries of the world, the United States has special forces operating, killing civilians, abducting informers, setting up sleeper cells, infiltrating the citizenry. 149 countries documented by the US researchers themselves where the special forces are employed. And special forces are the new way of conducting the US war. They've learned their lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan. These big forces will not give you the dividends, but the special forces will give you those dividends. You will create proxies, you will fund them, you will make the others pay for fighting for you. And so they've seen it successfully being done in Afghanistan lately. They've seen it being done successfully in Syria, and they've seen it being done in the Arab Spring as well. No US forces involved, special forces creating insurgents who were tackling and doing the job that the US wanted to do. We must also understand, I think, that there is a public narrative that exists in both US and Pakistan. The US public couldn't care less about Pakistan or about us. They're only ingrained in their own problems. The common man has public apathy towards anything outside the US. In Pakistan, there is a hostility to US. And this hostility is not of a transitional nature. It is a permanent feature. I think it is a real hostility. I also think that it is irreversible. And therefore, in all these, we must understand in terms of the goals that the US must have. So what are its near-term goals, strategic goals? I think it is in Afghanistan to defeat the Taliban and to govern Afghanistan in a manner in which its forces themselves feel comfortable, not very, very severely deprived in terms of loss of life. I think it also wants to calibrate the stability in Afghanistan because it wants to use it as a base both against China and Pakistan. I am a believer that it is very much practicing the doctrine of controlled chaos in Afghanistan because it is at the moment concerned with the security of the Pakistani nuclear weapons and also there are very extensive and very real efforts by the Americans to penetrate Pakistani society. And all you need to do is to just visit the diplomatic enclave in Islamabad and see the manner in which this massive upgradation of the US embassy, which is supposed to be in a country that doesn't mean anything to them, yet is one of the largest representation anyway, most of them perhaps populated by CIA operators. And in the long term, I think they are looking at a decisive civilian control of the military. They want a regress or a control over our nuclear weapons. They are looking at a contingency against a breakup of Pakistan. They look to counter China. And they wish to promote regional stability through an Indian preeminence. And what we find ourselves is caught in this weird quadrant where our future will be dictated by the interdependencies and relevances that we create. I think we need to transform the apathy and the strategic apathy, the strategic sympathy and the empathy and the affinity and avoid strategic hostility and isolation, which is prevalent both in the hostile US government and apathetic US public, but a simple, sympathetic military component. I think there is a need for us to look at our own internal situation, the dissensions and deteriorating economy, the creeping extremism, social disparity and political disharmony. And finally, we must look at our own policy formulations, which should be accompanied, I think, by policy ownership, which means you've got to take into consideration, into confidence, those who make policies, and that will lead us to greater, I think, domestic empowerment and success.
Wanted Pakistan, North Indian or otherwise, to be the place where the Muslims of South Asia could realize their full economic potential. What we made of that is something that we are still faced with. But the point is that this is what we should be looking for. Are we basing policy on trying to improve the economic lot of our people? Are we realizing that today Bangladesh, which was supposed to be the basket case of South Asia, the basket case of the world, has a higher per capita income than you do? Do we see that our national debt and our foreign debt have both achieved astronomical numbers while our exports remain at 20 billion, and our entire conversation is dominated?
That is our constraint. You have a circle which you create for your own influence, furthering your own agendas. And if it is in the OIC concepts that you are looking at, creating that kind of a body for influence, whether it is influential or not, whether it is siding with it or not, you have struck yourself in with a certain principled position. Because it's not just being able to go with Israel, it is also recognizing, not recognizing the right of Palestinians means giving up on Kashmiris as well. Because there is a congruity in terms of that situation. So, if you give up on the Palestinians, somebody is going to turn around and say, why are you so keen on the Kashmiris? So you are for the principle of that self-determination. You are for that international obligation that you have already extended. And therefore, you can make overtures. Yes, you don't need to make enemies of Israel. But if there is somebody else who is in a position to maneuver them, to use them for influences and create that sort of space for influence, like the question that was asked earlier, Israel and the Jewish lobby may not directly
to this discussion, and the horrific picture it has raised in my mind should Afghanistan collapse, because you have the economic situation you have spelled out in Afghanistan. I have a feeling that it won't even recover until 2030. I don't know why you chose that date. There must be some special reason for it. But also, I dread to think of a time in which Afghanistan goes back or goes into a situation in which it is divided again into a lot of fiefdoms, a lot of between various warlords. And you very rightly said that we should think sensibly about what we should do ourselves. So it has given me food for thought about the fact that maybe we can, maybe with your advice, we can develop a few sessions in which we can think seriously about what Pakistan should do in this connection. Thank you, General Saab. It was a pleasure having you here for the first time, and I hope it won't be the last time. I want to give you this journal. We've been